In the 1990s, the simple act of turning a baby over, just flipping them from their stomach to their back before they went to sleep, dropped the rate of sudden infant death syndrome by 80% in some participating
Well,
areas.
yeah, 80%.
I mean, 80%. That
Yeah.
is, there were no million-dollar pharmaceuticals, no high-tech monitors,
Right.
just gravity, positioning, and a massive public health campaign.
It really remains one of the most staggering public health victories of the 20th century.
Yeah.
But, it also highlights a pretty terrifying reality. For generations, well-meaning parents and, frankly, even medical professionals fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of infant sleep.
They really did. And today we're taking a deep dive into the Wikipedia page for sudden infant death syndrome, commonly known as SIDS or cot death.
It's a heavy topic.
It is, but the mission for this deep dive is to cut through the anxiety and the misinformation that surrounds infant sleep. Because whether you are a parent staring at a baby monitor at 2 a.m., or a caregiver, or just someone fascinated by medical mysteries in the justice system, this is for you.
Right. We're going to explore the hard science of what SIDs actually is.
Exactly. And the biological breakthroughs currently solving, decades-old cold cases, plus the simple evidence-based practices that have totally revolutionized safety.
But to do that, we have to start with the most frustrating aspect of this condition, which is the medical definition.
Yeah, I noticed that in the source material.
Because before science can cure or prevent a condition, pathologists have to define exactly what they are looking at. And with SIDs, the definition is entirely based on what it isn't.
Right. It's called a diagnosis of exclusion.
It is the ultimate diagnostic muddy water. I mean, SIDs is only declared when an infant under 1-year-old dies suddenly, and the death remains completely unexplained even after a truly exhaustive process.
So not just a quick check.
No. That means a thorough autopsy, a detailed death scene investigation, and a full review of the clinical history of the infant and the family.
So if a coroner finds evidence of a hidden heart defect or a severe respiratory infection or, God forbid, accidental suffocation from a blanket.
Then that is definitively not SIDS.
Okay.
Precisely. True SIDS usually occurs during sleep, statistically peaking between the hours of midnight and 9 a.m. with absolutely no noise or evidence of a struggle.
Which is understandably the core of why it terrifies parents so much.
Exactly.
It's the sheer invisibility of it.
Yeah, the invisibility.
But the terminology is actually shifting to reflect how complicated these investigations are, right? I mean, I'm seeing the acronym SUDI popping up more than SIs.
Yes, SEDI. In places like Australia and New Zealand, and increasingly in the U.S. through the CBC, the medical community is moving toward that term sudden unexpected death in infancy.
Okay, so SEDI.
Right. SIDs is now considered just a subset under that broader SUDI umbrella. Because as forensic science gets better, coroners are finding that what used to be labeled classical SIDs might actually be, an undetermined cause or an accidental suffocation.
Okay, let's unpack this. If SIDs is just an umbrella term for we don't know, how can we possibly fight it? I mean, we need a framework.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the leading medical framework for understanding SIDs right now is called the triple risk model.
The triple risk model.
Right. This model suggests that SID isn't just a random lightning strike event. It is the tragic intersection of 3 specific factors happening simultaneously.
Okay, what are the 3?
First, the infant has a hidden underlying biological vulnerability. Second, the infant is in a critical developmental period.
Like an age range.
Yes, specifically between 2 and 4 months of age, when their central nervous system's ability to rouse them from sleep is not yet fully mature.
Got it.
And third, they are exposed to an environmental stressor.
I look at that triple risk model like a catastrophic combination lock.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, you have these 3 tumblers. If the hidden biological flaw is present and the developmental age is right and the environmental stressor hits at the exact wrong moment, the lock opens and the tragedy happens.
Exactly.
But if you remove just one tumbler, like the environmental stressor, the mechanism fails. The storm dissipates.
And that is the exact mechanism of prevention. For decades, the agonizing part for doctors and parents was that we only understood the third tumbler.
The environment.
Right, the environment. We knew what triggered it, but the underlying biological vulnerability, that first tumbler, was a total black box.
But here is where it gets really interesting, because modern science is finally starting to crack open that black box.
It is.
The source highlights a massive breakthrough from a 2022 study involving an enzyme called BCEE.
Uterine cholinesterase.
Right, that one.
Researchers found that infants who later died of SIDS exhibited a significantly lower specific activity of this BCE enzyme shortly after birth compared to surviving infants.
Okay, I need an ELI 5 on this. Explain it like I'm 5. What does this enzyme actually do in a baby's body?
Sure. Think of BCE as a crucial gear in the brain's internal alarm clock.
Okay.
It's heavily involved in the brain's arousal pathway. In a healthy infant, if they experience a sudden lack of oxygen, maybe they roll over and their face gets pressed into a mattress, their autonomic nervous system detects the dropping oxygen and rings an alarm bell.
So it forces them to react.
Exactly. It forces the baby to wake up, gasp, turn their head, or cry.
But if there is a cholinergic dysfunction, like if that BCE enzyme activity is too low, the alarm bell is disconnected.
The brain simply doesn't tell the body to wake up and breathe.
Wow.
The baby remains in a deep sleep even as their oxygen levels plummet.
That is a phenomenal discovery. I mean, it takes away the mystery and replaces it with a measurable biological mechanism.
It really does.
And the source mentions that's not the only hidden vulnerability. There's a major genetic component as well, specifically something called channelopathies.
Right. Data shows that about 10 to 20% of SIDS cases are believed to be tied to inherited channelopathies.
Break down the mechanism there. How does a channelopathy stop a baby's heart?
Well, channelopathies are defects in the ion channels of the heart. You can picture ion channels as microscopic floodgates on the surface of heart muscle cells.
Floodgates, okay.
They open and close to let charged particles like sodium and potassium flow in and out. That flow of particles is the electrical signal that tells the heart to pump.
Oh, I see.
So if those microscopic floodgates are genetically faulty, they can jam. The electrical signal misfires, and the heart can suddenly go into a fatal arrhythmia.
So again, an invisible biological flaw that suddenly becomes fatal under the wrong conditions.
Exactly.
And understanding these genetic flaws isn't just a medical issue. I mean, it is fundamentally altering the justice system. We have to talk about Kathleen Folbig.
We do. It is one of the most heartbreaking intersections of biology and law in modern history.
It really is.
Kathleen Folbig was an Australian mother who spent 20 years in a maximum security prison. She was convicted of murdering her 4 children, whose deaths over a decade were initially unexplained.
Because the legal system, and frankly society at large, relied on a deeply flawed statistical assumption.
Yes.
The source mentions that back in the 1980s and 90s, some estimates claim that up to 40% of SIDS cases might actually be misidentified infanticide or child abuse.
Which is horrifying.
Right. The prevailing logic was essentially, 1, unexplained death is a tragedy, 2 is highly suspicious, and 3 must absolutely be murder.
But that 40% figure was incredibly inflated and destructive. Current data suggests intentional suffocation accounts for only about 1 to 5% of cases initially labeled as SIDS.
Only 1 to 5%.
Yeah. But Kathleen Folbig was caught in that era of intense suspicion. It wasn't until November 2020 that an international team of scientists published genetic evidence proving that at least 2 of her children had inherited mutations in the GandM2 gene.
Meaning they inherited a genetic vulnerability that predisposes infants to severe heart complications.
Right, like those channelopathies we just talked about.
Wow.
The science proved that multiple sudden deaths in one family were not the result of a serial killer mother, but a tragic, inherited genetic flaw.
And because of that biological breakthrough, she was officially pardoned and released in June 2023.
Yes, science turned the unexplained into the explained, correcting a massive miscarriage of justice.
I want to push back on something here, though, regarding how we categorize these tragedies.
Okay.
If pathologists today find a GandM2 gene mutation or an underlying metabolic disorder like MCAD deficiency, does the umbrella term SIDS actually obscure the real cause of death? Like, if we know it's a genetic heart failure, why call it SIDS?
That is an excellent question. And it's currently the subject of intense debate in forensic pathology.
Oh, really?
Yes, because the lines are incredibly blurred. An infant with an undetected susceptibility gene for a metabolic disorder might die if they are swaddled too warmly and put on their stomach.
So it's still an interaction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the autopsy doesn't specifically sequence their genome to look for that rare defect, it gets labeled as classical SIDS. Having a susceptibility gene doesn't guarantee a baby will die, and dying of SIDS doesn't mean you didn't have a susceptibility gene.
It's the environment.
Right, it's the interaction with the environment that often pulls the trigger.
Which brings us perfectly to the third tumbler of the combination lock, the environmental stressors. We cannot routinely screen for or fix all these genetic vulnerabilities yet.
No, we can't.
but we have incredible control over the environment.
And this is where the story pivots from diagnostic frustration to actionable hope. We know exactly how to manipulate the environment to keep that combination lock from opening.
What's wild to me is that for generations, the environmental triggers were things parents were doing intentionally because they genuinely thought it was best for the baby.
What's fascinating here is how deeply ingrained cultural habits can be. I mean, for decades, well-meaning parents placed babies to sleep on their stomachs because babies seem to sleep much deeper and longer that way.
Right.
Or they swaddled them in heavy, thick blankets to keep them warm.
Not realizing that a deeper sleep is exactly what you don't want if the baby's arousal pathway, their internal alarm clock, is already compromised.
Precisely.
So how exactly does sleeping on the stomach physically cause a problem?
Sleeping in the prone position, so on the stomach or even on the side, drastically increases the risk because it alters the mechanics of breathing. When a baby is face down, there is a much higher risk of them rebreathing their own exhaled carbon dioxide.
It's like sleeping with your face buried in a thick winter scarf.
Yes, exactly.
Instead of pulling in fresh, oxygen-rich air, the baby is just recycling a trapped pocket of their own exhaled carbon dioxide. And that buildup of CO2 slowly lulls the brain into a dangerously deep, unresponsive state.
That is the exact mechanism. If a healthy baby starts rebreathing CO2, their BCE enzyme kicks in, the alarm rings, and they wake up and turn their head.
But if they have the vulnerability,
If they have a hidden vulnerability, the alarm doesn't ring, and the CO2 buildup becomes fatal. That is why the Safe to Sleep campaign, which simply told parents to put infants to sleep on their backs, dropped SIDS rates so dramatically.
and it's not just positioning. The source highlights temperature as a massive factor. SIDS is actually linked to cold weather, which seems completely counterintuitive until you look at human behavior.
Right, the cold weather doesn't cause SIDS. Parents reacting to the cold weather causes the risk.
Yeah.
When the temperature drops, parents understandably want to keep their baby cozy. They turn the heat up, they add layers, they use heavy blankets. But overheating severely depresses the baby's arousal mechanism.
So they sleep too deep again.
Exactly. An overheated baby falls into a lethargic sleep and has a much harder time waking up if their oxygen levels drop.
If you're a parent listening to this, I always try to give a mental image to remember the ideal sleep environment. When you look at a safe crib, it shouldn't look cozy.
No, it really shouldn't.
You should look as boring and bare as an empty swimming pool.
And empty swimming pools, I like that.
I'm serious. Just a firm mattress, a fitted sheet, and the baby. The functional reason for the empty pool is that there's absolutely nothing to trap heat and nothing to trap exhaled carbon dioxide.
Nothing at all.
No fluffy blankets, no pillows, and definitely no bumper pads.
Yes, the source is explicitly clear about bumper pads. They are not recommended for children under 1 year of age. The minimal risk of a baby bumping their head against a crib bar is wildly outweighed by the risk of them rolling their face against a soft bumper pad and trapping that pocket of carbon dioxide.
Now, let's talk about sleeping arrangements, because this is where a lot of modern parenting debates get, heated. Co-sleeping versus room sharing.
The distinction between those two terms is literally life and death. Room sharing means having the baby in a separate crib or bassinet, but in the same room as the parents.
Okay.
The data shows room sharing decreases the risk of SIDs by up to 50%.
Just having them breathe the same circulating air and hearing the ambient noise of the parents keeps them in a slightly lighter, safer sleep state?
Yes, that's the theory. But bed sharing, bringing the infant into the adult bed to sleep, significantly increases the risk of SIDs and accidental suffocation.
Because an adult bed is the opposite of the empty swimming pool.
Exactly. It is soft, it has heavy duvets, and it has sleeping adults who might roll over.
Yeah.
And the risk multiplies exponentially if the parents are smoking, drinking alcohol, or using drugs.
I know the source heavily emphasizes the link between SIDs and tobacco, but I have to ask. We know smoking is bad for general health, but does it physically cause SIDs, or is it just a correlation with poorer health outcomes in general?
Oh, it is a direct mechanical trigger. Maternal smoking during pregnancy actually doubles the risk of SIDs.
Doubles it. Wow.
Roughly 22% of SIDs cases in the United States are related to maternal smoking. And it's not just about secondhand smoke irritating the lungs after the baby is born. The science shows that nicotine and its derivatives fundamentally alter the baby's neurodevelopment in utero.
Wait, so the nicotine is physically rewiring the brain's arousal pathway before the baby even takes their first breath?
Exactly. The exposure to nicotine blunts the infant's physiological responses to low oxygen, It effectively creates the biological vulnerability, that first tumbler of the lock, making the baby far more susceptible to an environmental stressor later on.
So if the science shows us that the real dangers are largely invisible, things like enzyme deficits, microscopic ion channels, and altered neurodevelopment, it makes total sense why parents panic.
It really does.
When you can't see the real threat, human nature invents one you can fight, which leads us to some massive societal misconceptions.
Yeah, when parents are terrified, they look for a tangible enemy. A perfect example is the mattress fire retardant panic of 1994.
Right, the infamous Cook Report in the UK.
Yes.
This was a television program that claimed SIDS was caused by toxic gases. The theory was that antimony and phosphorus compounds, which were used as fire retardants in PVC crib mattresses, were generating a lethal gas that poisoned the babies.
And you can see why that took hold. It sounds incredibly plausible to a worried parent. It gives them an enemy they could defeat just by a chemical-free mattress.
Right, problem solved.
But a subsequent investigation by an independent expert panel found absolutely zero evidence for this claim. The chemistry didn't add up, toxic gas couldn't be generated in those conditions, and tragically, babies were still dying of SIDS on mattresses that didn't contain a drop of those compounds.
So it was a complete myth driven by fear, not science.
Absolutely.
And then there's the vaccine paradox. If you're a parent, human brains are natural pattern matching machines, right? Infants typically receive several routine vaccinations between the ages of 2 and 4 months.
Which happens to be the exact peak developmental window for SIDS.
Exactly. So a parent takes their healthy baby in for a vaccine. A week later, the infant tragically passes away. The grieving brain immediately connects the two events. Correlation becomes causation.
It's a very understandable leap to make.
But the data tells a completely different story, doesn't it?
The data actually tells the exact opposite story. Numerous studies have investigated this perceived link. A massive 2007 meta-analysis found that vaccinations are associated with a halving of the risk of SIDS.
Wait, a halving?
Yes. Babies who are vaccinated have a 50% lower risk.
How does a vaccine prevent a sudden, unexplained death? What's the mechanism there?
It basically comes down to immune priming. Many researchers believe that a portion of SIDS cases are triggered by minor, undetected respiratory infections.
Like a mild cold.
Right. A healthy baby fights off a mild cold easily. But if a baby has a hidden biological vulnerability, the slight fever and inflammation from a mild infection can act as the environmental stressor that pushes their system over the edge.
Oh, I see.
Vaccines train and prime the immune system, effectively removing one of those potential stressors. The source argues that immunization should be heavily promoted as a core part of SIDS prevention.
You know, if you're listening to this and looking at the expensive, high-tech electronic baby monitor on your registry, you're probably wondering, doesn't this solve the problem? Won't an alarm alert me?
And the reality is,
the data shows those multi-million-dollar gadgets haven't been shown to be useful. They don't have FDA medical approval for preventing SIDs.
no, they don't.
The gadget industry is basically selling reassurance, not actual prevention. Meanwhile, the most effective solutions are completely free or cost about $3, like a pacifier.
The pacifier data is fascinating. Offering a pacifier at sleep time significantly lowers the risk of SIDs, and the protective effect remains even if the pacifier falls out of the baby's mouth after they fall asleep.
Why would a tiny piece of plastic help keep a baby alive?
The mechanism goes back to keeping the brain engaged. Sucking on a pacifier requires coordination of the airway muscles, which pulls the tongue forward and keeps the airway physically open.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
It also seems to keep the autonomic nervous system slightly active, preventing the baby from dropping into that dangerously deep, unresponsive level of sleep.
It is profound how much power is actually in our hands when we strip away the commercial fear-mongering and look at the actual evidence.
It really is.
We've gone from a place of total darkness, blaming grieving mothers and toxic mattresses, to understanding the mechanics of a perfect storm. We know how to remove the environmental stressors. We know why the crib needs to be an empty pool.
And medical science is actively closing in on the biological vulnerabilities like the BCE enzyme and genetic channelopathies.
Understanding the why behind safe sleep guidelines replaces that paralyzing 2 a.m. fear with empowered, actionable knowledge. But before we wrap up, there is one final piece of data in the source that is incredibly thought-provoking.
Yes.
SIDS isn't an equal opportunity tragedy, is it?
It isn't. There is a persistent gender disparity. There is a 50% excess in male SIDS deaths compared to females.
50%.
Yes. It's significantly more common in boys across almost all demographics.
Why would boys be biologically more vulnerable to this perfect storm?
Scientists have proposed what's called the X-linkage hypothesis. The mechanism comes down to how our brains handle transient cerebral anoxia, which is a temporary lack of oxygen to the brain.
Okay.
The theory suggests that females who have two X chromosomes might carry a dominant protective genetic allele on one of those X chromosomes. This allele essentially guards the brain during temporary oxygen loss, buying the baby time to wake up.
But because males only have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, if they don't inherit that specific protective allele on their single X chromosome, they are left entirely vulnerable.
Right. They have no genetic backup system.
Exactly, no backup system.
It suggests that the ultimate key to completely eradicating SIDS might not just be in sleep environments or pacifiers, but hiding deep in human evolution and the protective mechanisms of the X chromosome itself.
Now, that is a thought to linger on. The idea that human evolution might have built a biological shield against this, and we just need to figure out how to replicate it.
It's incredible.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the things that scare you, keep learning the mechanisms behind the myths, and remember that when it comes to the unknown, the best tool we have is evidence. We'll see you next time. I want you to picture St. Patrick's Day. Like, what immediately comes to mind?
Oh, probably green beer.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
If you are like most people, you are probably picturing rowdy street parades, a pint of green beer, those oversized novelty leprechaun hats.
Oh, yeah, you see those everywhere.
You really do. And maybe even entire rivers dyed a vibrant fluorescent green. It is this massive, incredibly distinct cultural aesthetic.
It's totally unmistakable.
Right. But what if I told you that almost everything you think you know about this holiday is actually, well, a modern invention?
Yeah, that's the crazy part.
It is. What if I told you that these traditions were largely created thousands of miles away from Ireland, and the man the day is named after wasn't even Irish to begin with?
It is genuinely one of the most remarkable historical makeovers we have on record. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape of cultural history that is, incredibly murky.
Super murky.
Yeah. The myths have totally overshadowed the historical reality. It's basically created a version of the past that serves the present, rather than reflecting what actually happened.
And our mission for this deep dive is to untangle all of that. We have a comprehensive stack of historical and cultural source material in front of us, and we are going to unpack the bizarre, centuries-long evolution of St. Patrick's Day.
It's quite the journey.
It really is. We are going to explore exactly how a somber, strictly religious feast day transformed into like the most widely celebrated national festival on Earth.
Yep.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even touch on the parades and the pints of stout, we have to start with the actual guy the day is named after.
We have to.
Because looking at his real story in the sources, it reads way more like a grim survival narrative than the cheerful folklore we all grew up with.
Absolutely. I mean, the man we call St. Patrick was actually born in Roman Britain. This was in the 4th century.
Right, Roman Britain, so not Ireland at all.
Not at all. He was born into a wealthy Romano-British family. His father was a Christian deacon, and his grandfather was a priest.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he was living a very comfortable, established life in this civilized outpost of the Roman Empire.
So he basically has everything going for him.
Pretty much.
And then at the age of 16, his entire world just collapses. I mean, he doesn't just decide to visit Ireland on a whim, right? He is taken there by force.
Right. According to the Declaration, which is a document allegedly written by Patrick himself, he was kidnapped by Irish raiders.
That is just terrifying to think about.
It is. He was dragged across the sea as a slave to Gaelic Ireland. And you have to remember, at the time, this was a completely foreign pagan landscape to him.
A total culture shock on top of the trauma.
Exactly. He was forced to work as a shepherd in total isolation. He was exposed to the elements, completely stripped of his former identity, and he endured that captivity for 6 grueling years.
6 years. 6 years as an enslaved teenager. I want you to just, imagine the psychological toll of that.
It's unimaginable.
But the Declaration says he doesn't break. He claims he actually found God during this isolation. And eventually, a divine voice told him to flee to the coast where a ship was waiting.
And he actually makes it.
Yeah. He escapes, makes this perilous journey all the way back home to Britain, and eventually becomes a priest.
Which is an incredible feat on its own, just surviving that ordeal and making it home.
Seriously.
But the turning point of his legend, however, is his decision to return. Tradition holds that he made the conscious, incredibly dangerous choice to go back to the very people who enslaved him.
That is wild. I mean, why go back?
Well, this time, he went as a missionary. He was determined to convert the pagan Irish to Christianity. And the sources say he spent years traveling the northern half of Ireland, reportedly converting thousands of people.
I'm looking at the sources on how he actually accomplished those conversions, and it brings us to, like, the most famous part of his legend, the shamrock.
Ah, yes, the shamrock.
Right. So the story goes that he used the three-leaf shamrock to explain the concept of the Holy Trinity. You know, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Yep.
But I want you to think about the marketing challenge here. If you were trying to introduce a completely abstract, foreign theological concept to a new demographic, you can't just, like, hand them a dense philosophical manuscript.
You really can't.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating here is exactly why that specific botanical symbol was so incredibly effective. You have to understand the audience he was speaking to.
Right.
The number 3 was already highly significant in pagan Ireland.
Mm-hmm.
The Celts had this cosmological vision of triplicity.
Oh, interesting. So they already cared about the number 3.
Deeply. They worshipped many triple deities, and their art was full of the triskel, which is this threefold spiral motif.
So he essentially looked at their culture, saw how deeply embedded the number 3 was, and just picked up a weed from the dirt to bridge the gap. That's like brilliant local marketing.
It really is.
Yeah.
And whether it was a deliberate genius strategy by Patrick himself or, just a clever legend projected onto him centuries later by the church, it worked.
Right. The outcome is the same.
Exactly. There is no hard historical evidence that the shamrock itself was sacred to the pagan Irish, but the threefold visual certainly was.
Mm-hmm.
He basically packaged a radical new religion in a deeply familiar native visual.
Making the transition feel natural rather than forced.
Precisely.
And that shamrock visual is so powerful that today it dictates the entire aesthetic of the holiday. I mean, you literally cannot celebrate this day without wearing green.
No, you'd stand out like a sore thumb.
Right. But flipping through our historical sources reveals a massive contradiction here, because the color originally associated with St. Patrick wasn't green at all.
Nope.
It was blue.
Yeah, it's St. Patrick's blue.
Mm.
If we look back to 1783, the Order of St. Patrick, which was this Anglo-Irish chivalric order, adopted blue as its official color.
Wow.
Yeah, for a very long time, if you were depicting the saint or his order, you used a very specific shade of blue.
I am genuinely struggling to reconcile this. Today, if I wear blue on March 17th, I am going to get pinched by my coworkers.
You definitely will.
So how do we get from, like, official chivalric blue to mandatory fluorescent green?
Well, the transition has deeply layered roots, and the first layer is pure mythology. The earliest association of the color green with the concept of Ireland actually comes from an 11th century legend.
Okay.
It's about a figure named Goidel Glass, which translates to Godidel the Green. He's considered the eponymous ancestor of the Gaels.
Okay, so where does the green come in?
According to this myth, he was bitten by a venomous snake. But his life was saved when the biblical figure Moses placed his staff on the snake bite.
Wait, Moses. The idea of an Irish ancestor doing a crossover episode with Moses in the desert is just incredible to me.
It really highlights how mythologies blend over time. The story claims that the healing touch left Godi with a distinct green mark.
Oh, I see.
Furthermore, his descendants were prophesied to eventually settle in a land entirely free of snakes.
Which points straight to Ireland.
Exactly. So when one of his descendants supposedly caught sight of a beautiful green island in the distance, an island famously lacking native snakes, the association between the people, the land, and the color green was cemented in folklore.
That's a great story, but folklore doesn't really explain how a color becomes a mandatory uniform for millions of people.
No, it doesn't.
The sources show the true, hard political shift to the color green happened centuries later in the 1790s. And this wasn't about cheerful spring colors. This was actually incredibly dangerous.
It was deadly. The 1790s brought the era of the United Irishmen. They were a revolutionary Republican organization.
Right.
They were founded mostly by Protestants, but they had a massive Catholic membership. Their whole goal was to launch a rebellion against British rule, which culminated in the 1798 rebellion.
So they needed a symbol.
Exactly. They needed a unifying symbol, and they adopted the color green. Suddenly, wearing green wasn't about a myth anymore. It was a direct declaration of treason against the British Crown.
The sources mention a very famous song from that era called The Wearing of the Green, and it is literally a song about members of the United Irishmen being persecuted, punished, and even killed just for displaying the color on their clothing.
It's pretty heavy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
At that same time, in 1795, William Drennan, who was a co-founder of the United Irishmen, wrote a poem that coined the phrase the Emerald Isle.
Wow, so that's where that comes from.
Yeah, the color was truly becoming weaponized as a tool for national identity.
And they clearly didn't let that go. Fast forward to 1922, the Irish Free State is finally founded, and they take this color association to a literal extreme.
They really did.
The sources say the new government ordered that all the old British red post boxes across the country be painted green. Their actual stated slogan was "Green paint for green people."
That's a strong statement.
Yeah, and by 1924, they had introduced a green Irish passport. But here's what I don't understand.
Okay.
You have people being severely punished for wearing green in the 1790s. It is a deadly political statement. How does a symbol of violent rebellion get so diluted that millions of people worldwide wear it to a party without even knowing the history?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the life cycle of cultural movements and emigration. Political symbols often lose their dangerous, revolutionary edge as they travel across oceans and generations.
Makes sense.
For the Irish diaspora, the millions of people who left Ireland wearing green stopped being a way to signal participation in an act of rebellion. Instead, it morphed into a generalized badge of cultural pride.
It became a safe way to say, I belong to this heritage.
Exactly.
Which means the transition from a dangerous political statement to a light-hearted party wasn't primarily driven by the people living in Ireland, it was driven by the people who left.
Yeah, and this might actually be the most surprising fact in our entire stack of sources. The very first St. Patrick's Day parades did not happen in Ireland.
Still blows my mind.
They started in North America. The earliest recorded St. Patrick's celebration in what is now the United States took place in St. Augustine, Florida, all the way back in 1601.
Wait, 1601. Long before the United States was even a concept, there was a St. Patrick's Day celebration in Florida.
Yes.
And the data shows that until the late 20th century, this holiday was actually a much bigger deal among the diaspora in places like America, Canada, and Australia than it ever was back in the homeland.
We have to consider the immigrant experience here, particularly during the massive waves of immigration in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Okay.
Irish immigrants arriving in North America often faced severe prejudice, poverty, and systemic marginalization. They were largely treated as a disadvantaged underclass.
So when they organized these massive, loud public parades down the main streets of major cities like New York and Boston, it wasn't just a party.
Not at all.
It was a massive show of civic strength. It was a way of proving to the local establishment that they had numbers, they had solidarity, and they could not be ignored.
Exactly.
It's almost like having a quiet family tradition, but then you move to a new town where you don't know anyone.
Right, and you feel isolated and often distinctly unwelcome in that new environment.
So to stand out and to prove you belong, you suddenly make that tradition 10 times louder and more colorful than it ever was back home. You basically exaggerate your own traits because it is the anchor connecting you to your identity when you feel like an outsider.
That's a perfect way to look at it. And that exaggerated visibility eventually translated into genuine political power. The diaspora influence grew so potent that the holiday became a formal diplomatic tool.
Which is how we get the Shamrock Bowl.
Yes. By 1952, the Irish ambassador to the U.S. sent a box of shamrocks to President Harry S. Truman.
And that simple gesture evolved into the modern tradition we see today, right? Where the Irish Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, travels to Washington every March to present the U.S. president with a Waterford crystal bowl overflowing with shamrocks.
Yeah, it's a huge diplomatic event now.
But this massively exported, exaggerated version of the holiday has a lot of critics. Our sources highlight a heavy pushback against a concept known as plastic paddiness.
Yeah, plastic paddiness. It's a critical term used to describe the appropriation and misrepresentation of Irish culture, often by people with no actual connection to the country.
Right.
There is deep frustration over how commercialized the holiday has become abroad. It often reduces a very complex culture to a caricature focused entirely on public drunkenness.
The sources specifically mentioned the anger over those cheap leprechaun outfits that flood the parades every year. And I always assume they're just like harmless fairy tale costumes, but the history there is actually pretty dark.
It is very dark. Those specific costumes, the buckled shoes, the exaggerated hats, the red beards, they are heavily based on highly derogatory 19th century caricatures.
Really?
Yes, these were cartoons used by the British and American press to demean Irish immigrants. They portrayed them as aggressive, almost subhuman figures.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, so seeing those same demeaning stereotypes repackaged and worn as festive party gear today is deeply insulting to many who know the history.
That completely changes how I look at those hats. But I want to pivot back across the Atlantic for a second.
Sure.
While the diaspora was in America and Australia throwing massive parades, taking over streets and wearing green, I want you to imagine what was actually happening back in Ireland on March 17th, because the contrast is staggering.
Oh, it's night and day. For centuries in Ireland, St. Patrick's Day was not a party. It was a strict, holy day of obligation.
So very serious.
Deeply serious religious observance. The focal point of the day was attending Mass. The pubs were quiet, the streets were quiet.
But there was one crucial religious loophole built into the calendar that eventually seeded the global drinking culture we associate with the day. St. Patrick's Day always falls right in the middle of Lent.
Which is key. Lent is the 40-day period of prayer, penance, and fasting leading up to Easter.
Right.
During this time, consuming alcohol and certain rich foods is traditionally forbidden. However, because March 17th was a recognized feast day, the strict Lenten restrictions on fasting and drinking were temporarily lifted.
They hit a 24-hour pause button on the fasting. I imagine that sudden release valve got out of hand pretty quickly.
It certainly created a concentrated window of indulgence. Because of that brief lifting of the rules, drinking alcohol, specifically Irish whiskey, stout, and cider, became an integral part of the afternoon.
And didn't that give rise to a specific custom?
Yes, an old custom called drowning the shamrock. At the end of the night, a shamrock was placed into the bottom of a cup, which was then filled with whiskey or beer and drunk as a final toast to the saint.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. You have this tradition of drowning the shamrock, but when the Irish Free State was finally established in the 1920s, they looked at this growing revelry and they completely shut it down.
They did.
From 1927 all the way until 1961, the Irish Free State legally banned the sale of alcohol on St. Patrick's Day.
It is a phenomenal historical irony.
Isn't it?
The single day of the year that the entire globe associates with Irish pub culture was legally dry in its homeland for 34 years.
34 years.
The government literally forced the pubs to lock their doors to curb public intoxication and force the population to keep the focus strictly on religious piety.
Think about that. For over 3 decades, if you walked into Dublin on St. Patrick's Day wanting a pint, you were out of luck.
Completely out of luck.
Meanwhile, if we look at the sources for Northern Ireland during the latter half of the 20th century, the history of the holiday took a much darker, much more complicated path. And we just want to impartially report on the sources here because the history is heavily tied to the Troubles.
Right. In Northern Ireland, St. Patrick's Day was deeply entangled in the political and sectarian conflict known as the Troubles, which lasted from the late 1960s to the late 1990s.
And the population was very divided.
Yes, roughly divided. You had a majority of Protestant Ulster Unionists who saw themselves primarily as British, and a substantial minority of Catholic Irish nationalists who saw themselves primarily as Irish.
And because of that severe demographic divide, our sources show the holiday became highly polarized.
Extremely polarized. The Unionist government in Northern Ireland did not officially observe the holiday. During the decades of the Troubles, public celebrations were rare and were almost exclusively associated with the Catholic nationalist community.
And tragically, the day sometimes became a flashpoint for the ongoing violence. The sources recount that in 1976, loyalist paramilitaries detonated a car bomb outside a pub crowded with Catholics celebrating St. Patrick's Day in Dungannon.
Yes, the blast killed 4 civilians and injured many others. It was a horrific event.
So the sources show it remained a deeply fractured day for a long time.
It did. There were gradual attempts to shift the narrative over the years. In 1985, some Protestant Unionists attempted to reclaim a connection to the festival, with the Orange Order holding its own St. Patrick's Day parade.
Okay.
But the definitive turning point came with the end of the conflict. Following the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, the political landscape transformed.
And how did that affect the holiday?
Well, towns throughout Northern Ireland began organizing cross-community St. Patrick's Day parades. These were deliberately designed to draw thousands of spectators from all backgrounds, turning a symbol of division into an exercise in shared cultural space.
Which is an incredible shift. And right around that same time, in the mid-1990s, the Republic of Ireland had a massive realization of its own.
They really woke up to what was happening globally.
Yeah, the government looked at how the rest of the world, places like New York, Chicago, Sydney, was celebrating March 17th. And they realized they were sitting on a gold mine of soft power that they were entirely ignoring.
They finally recognized that this exported, slightly chaotic diaspora festival was an unparalleled tool for global public relations. So the Irish government deliberately set out to reclaim ownership of the holiday.
And that led to the big festival, right?
Exactly. In 1996, they launched the very first St. Patrick's Festival in Dublin. The strategic goal was to project an accurate, modern image of Ireland as a dynamic, creative, and sophisticated country.
While also finally giving international tourists the massive, multi-day party they had come to expect.
Right? They gave the people what they wanted.
They essentially licensed their own culture back from the diaspora, upgraded it, and hosted the party themselves. And that 1990s push really sparked a global phenomenon that has now reached the most unlikely places imaginable. The sources detail something called the Global Greening Initiative.
Oh, this is fantastic. Started in 2010 by Tourism Ireland. This initiative involves coordinating with foreign governments and organizations to bathe famous international landmarks in green light on March 17th.
Wow.
It began with the Sydney Opera House and the Sky Tower in Auckland. Today, it includes over 300 landmarks across 50 different countries.
It is genuinely everywhere. I was reading about a tiny Caribbean island called Montserrat. Have you heard of this?
I have, yeah.
It is one of the only places in the world outside of Ireland to actually have St. Patrick's Day as an official public holiday. They literally call themselves the Emerald Island of the Caribbean.
That's amazing. Why is that?
Because the island was heavily populated by Irish refugees and indentured servants in the 17th century, they actually used the day to commemorate a 1768 slave uprising.
See, the way local communities adapt the day is just fascinating.
Totally.
For example, for years, the village of Dripsey in County Cork proudly held the record for the world's shortest St. Patrick's Day parade. The entire route lasted just 23.4 meters.
Wait, 23.4 meters?
Yep. That was the exact distance between the village's two pubs.
I respect the efficiency, although apparently towns in Arkansas and Rhode Island are currently fighting over who gets to claim that title now.
Of course they are.
But the celebration hasn't just gone global, it has literally broken the atmosphere.
Yes. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station have made it a tradition.
That's so cool.
In 2011, an Irish-American astronaut named Catherine Coleman celebrated by floating weightless in orbit, playing a 100-year-old antique flute belonging to Matt Malloy of the traditional Irish music group The Chieftains. And 2 years later, Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield posted a recording of himself singing Danny Boy directly from space.
I am looking at all of this, and I have to step back and ask, why this specific holiday? We do not see astronauts on the space station busting out century-old instruments for other national days.
No, we really don't.
We don't see the Colosseum in Rome or the Sydney Opera House lighting up for someone else's Independence Day. What is it about St. Patrick's Day that transcends borders, cultures, and literal gravity?
This raises an important question about the sociology of the holiday today. St. Patrick's Day has evolved far beyond its origins as a specific ethnic and religious observance.
Right.
Because it was exported so successfully by a desperate diaspora, its core modern tenets, music, gathering, drinking, and wearing a bright unifying color, became highly accessible.
Anyone can join in.
Exactly. It transformed into a universal celebration of community and resilience. And in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, it also serves as a secular marker for the arrival of spring.
Just a reason to celebrate after a long winter?
Yeah. You no longer have to be Irish to participate in the underlying themes of survival and community joy.
So what does this all mean? I want you to look back at the journey we just took. We started with a kidnapped Romano-British teenager in the 5th century herding sheep in the freezing rain.
A very bleak start.
Right. That horrific experience morphed into a deeply serious, completely dry religious holiday in Ireland. Meanwhile, millions of desperate immigrants took his name across the ocean, slapped a political color on it that wasn't even his original symbol, and marched in the streets to prove their own humanity.
The layers of history are just incredible.
And today, people are floating in zero gravity playing flutes, while the entire globe is bathed in green light.
It is a profound evolution, and I think it leaves us with a fascinating concept to mull over. St. Patrick's Day is one of the rarest historical examples of a complete cultural feedback loop.
How so?
Well, you have to ask yourself, what happens to a culture's identity when its defining national holiday is primarily shaped, popularized, and commercialized by the people who left that culture centuries ago?
That is a wild thought.
Who really owns a tradition once the whole world is invited to the party?
I'll leave you to think about that. So the next time you find yourself standing on a street corner, holding a plastic cup of green beer and adjusting a cheap velvet leprechaun hat.
Try to remember where it all came from.
Exactly. Just remember, you aren't just celebrating an Irish saint. You are participating in a centuries-old story of survival, rebellion, clever marketing, and the unstoppable power of immigrants trying to find their place in a new world.
You might not realize it, but some of the absolute deadliest diseases out there, things like certain aggressive cancers or HIV or even parasitic worms,
Right.
they actually use this specific biological cheat code to hide from your immune system. Like they drape themselves in this specialized glycoprotein disguise that basically tells your white blood cells to just stand down.
Yeah, it's a brilliant survival mechanism, but, they didn't invent that disguise.
Yeah, actually, they hijacked it.
Yeah.
They stole it from a microscopic machine that is built by the human body itself.
A machine whose entire sole purpose is to survive a really hostile environment, deliver this densely encrypted genetic payload, and execute an incredibly precise chemical breach.
Yeah, we are, of course, talking about the male reproductive cell.
And it completely shatters the simplistic view we usually have of this biology, right? I mean, in introductory classes, we're shown this really basic diagram. It's just a flat little circle with a squiggly tail.
Like a tiny biological tadpole.
Exactly. But the reality is that the male gamete is this highly specialized, just remarkably complex deployment system engineered for survival.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because our mission today in this deep dive is to shortcut your way to understanding the sheer mechanical genius of this cell.
We really want to get past the high school biology version.
Right. So we pulled a stack of sources, starting with excerpts from the Wikipedia page on sperm, and we were just throwing out that two-dimensional textbook drawing entirely. We want to look at the microscopic chemical warfare, the evolutionary extremes, and honestly, the bizarre legal frameworks humans have built around this stuff.
It's fascinating. But to really understand the engineering, we have to look at the fundamental strategy of human reproduction first, which relies on this concept called anisogamy.
Anisogamy.
Yeah, anisogamy. It's essentially the ultimate biological division of labor, because reproduction here requires two gametes, but they are of vastly different sizes.
Right. The female cell, the ovum or the egg, is massive by comparison.
Huge, because it contains all the cellular machinery, the nutrients, the cytoplasm. Basically, everything needed to sustain a new life is packed in there.
And then you have the male cell.
Right. The much smaller male cell, which is entirely stripped down for mobility. Its job isn't to build the new organism. Its job is literally just to deliver half of the nuclear genetic blueprint, so 23 chromosomes in humans, across a really treacherous environment.
And building that delivery vehicle is a massive logistical undertaking all on its own. Like if you look at the process of spermatogenesis, which is the manufacturing phase in the testicles' seminiferous tubules.
Yeah, it's incredibly involved.
It looks like a painstakingly slow spacecraft assembly line. You start with this precursor cell that divides, has its chromosomes, but from that starting point to having a fully mature, mission-ready cell, the body takes roughly 3 months.
Which sounds like a long time for a single cell.
It does. It spends about 70 days just on the initial construction and then another 60 days just on maturation.
Well, the length of that assembly line makes sense when you consider the extreme structural modifications taking place. The cell literally sheds almost all of its cytoplasm.
The cytoplasm being that jelly-like substance that fills normal cells, right?
Right. It just throws it out to reduce weight and improve its aerodynamics for swimming. What you're left with is an anatomy optimized into three distinct sections. First, you have the head.
Which is packed with the DNA.
Exactly. But it's not a simple container. It houses DNA that is densely coiled into these tight chromatin fibers. And at the very tip of that head is a structure called the acrosome. It's a flattened sac that is just brimming with highly specialized digestive enzymes.
I pictured it like a microscopic payload of acid meant to burn through a vault door.
That is its exact function, which we'll see in the final stages of its journey. But behind the head is the midpiece. This acts as the powerhouse. It's packed with 10 to 14 spirals of mitochondria wrapped tightly around a central filament.
Wow, just coiled right in there.
Coiled up tight. And finally, you have the flagellum, the tail. It's about 50 micrometers long, and it has to generate enough force to propel this entire structure at speeds of 1 to 3 millimeters per minute.
Which doesn't sound fast to us.
No, but at a microscopic scale, trying to push through viscous fluids, that is a monumental physical feat.
I have to admit, reading through the sources, the complexity really threw me.
Yeah.
Because if the female ovum handles all the heavy lifting of actually growing the embryo, and this cell is basically just a microscopic USB drive carrying 23 chromosomes.
Right, to just plug into the egg.
Yeah. Why does it have a parts list of at least 7,500 different proteins? And the DNA itself is compacted 6 times tighter than the DNA in any of our regular somatic cells.
Yeah.
It just feels completely over-engineered for a simple delivery run.
Well, that over-engineering is necessary because the delivery parameters are so strict. I mean, the tight compaction of the DNA being 6 times denser than normal, that is pure spatial efficiency. The cell has to be as small and light as physically possible to keep moving.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it brings more than just the genetic code. It actually carries a specific signaling factor designed to jolt the egg out of a metabolically dormant state upon entry.
Oh, wow. So it wakes the egg up.
It does. And crucially, it also delivers a structure called the centriole.
Yes. I noticed that in the text. It's like the egg has everything it needs to divide except the spark plug.
That's a great way to put it. The centriole is essentially the structural anchor. Once fertilization happens, the new zygote needs to start pulling itself apart to multiply. The male centriole acts as the organizing center for the microtubule system.
Which is the scaffolding for cell division.
Exactly. Without it, the fertilized egg would just sit there. It couldn't develop. And what's equally revealing is what the cell leaves behind.
Right.
All those spiraling mitochondria in the midpiece that power the tail, they degrade and are completely destroyed after fertilization.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this is why you inherit your mitochondrial DNA almost exclusively from your mother. The male provides the blueprints and the ignition switch, but none of the long-term metabolic machinery.
So the powerhouse does its job and then just gets discarded. So, okay, the machine is built, the payload is packed. Now we get to the deployment. And once it leaves the male body, it enters an environment that is biologically designed to be hostile.
Extremely hostile.
The female reproductive tract is highly acidic to protect against bacterial infections. And this tiny cell is fragile, it degrades in warm environments, and now it has to swim through literal acid.
Which is why the deployment requires synchronized chemical warfare. The fluid carrying the cells, the semen, is naturally alkaline. Its first biological objective is to neutralize those acidic vaginal fluids.
Creating a temporary, localized safe zone.
Right. However, the sperm cells are not fully operational the second they arrive. It takes them 20 to 30 minutes to boot up their systems and reach a state of hypermotility where they can actually swim effectively.
So during that window, they're basically sitting ducks.
Complete sitting ducks.
So they drop a bunker. I love this part. Fibrinogen, which is a chemical from the seminal vesicles, actually forms a protective clot around the cells right after deployment.
It physically locks them in a biological shield.
Right, while they get their engines running. And then once that 20 to 30-minute boot-up sequence is complete, a completely different chemical called fibrinolysin, which is released by the prostate gland, acts like a blowtorch.
Dissolving the clot.
Yeah, it dissolves the clot and releases them for the final sprint.
It's a perfectly timed multi-stage deployment, but, that physical bunker only solves the acid problem. They still have to deal with the female immune system.
Because to the female body, these are invaders.
Exactly. From the perspective of the female immune system, these cells are foreign invaders carrying alien DNA. Standard biological logic dictates that white blood cells should immediately swarm and destroy them.
So how do they survive that?
To prevent an immunological slaughter, the sperm cells utilize that specific glycoprotein coating we mentioned earlier. It essentially acts as an invisibility cloak.
The same exact cloak that cancer and HIV hijack.
That's the one. The cell is broadcasting a molecular signal saying, I belong here, do not engage.
And it works.
It works flawlessly. But here's the profound irony of this whole system. The male body actually has to protect these cells from its own immune system while they are being manufactured.
Wait, his own immune system would attack them?
Yes. Because the cells undergo genetic shuffling during meiosis, their DNA no longer perfectly matches the rest of the man's body. His own white blood cells would recognize them as a threat and destroy them before they ever leave.
So the body builds a wall. The blood test is barrier.
Exactly.
It's a literal physical barricade of tightly joined Sertoli cells that keeps the male's blood supply and all the immune cells within it completely separated from the developing sperm. The cell is a total foreigner from the moment of its creation.
It is entirely isolated, and that isolation, combined with its stripped-down anatomy, creates a major vulnerability.
Yeah.
We really need to talk about the payload itself.
Right.
Because they jettison their cytoplasm to save weight, they also jettison most of the defensive mechanisms, like antioxidants, that normal cells use to protect their DNA.
So what does this all mean for someone living in the modern world? Because, I mean, we are surrounded by things that damage DNA.
We are.
The sources are very clear. The human spermatozoa are exceptionally vulnerable to free radicals and oxidative stress. We are talking about everyday environmental hazards: tobacco smoke, occupational exposure to benzene, widespread insecticides, and perfluorinated compounds.
Those are the forever chemicals, or PFAS.
Exactly.
Well, exposure to those chemicals significantly increases the rate of DNA fragmentation and a condition called aneuploidy.
Aneuploidy. What is that exactly?
Aneuploidy simply means the cell ends up with an incorrect number of chromosomes, so maybe 22 or 24 instead of the required 23. And if a cell with aneuploidy manages to fertilize an egg, it usually leads to severe fertility issues, miscarriages, or pretty deleterious developmental effects on the embryo.
I was wondering about quality control with all of this. Like, if the DNA is packed 6 times tighter than normal and they have no cytoplasm, are they just sitting ducks for oxidative damage? Or is it any internal repair mechanism?
You know, for decades, biologists assumed they were completely defenseless because the physical space is so constrained that the bulky molecular machinery required for DNA repair simply shouldn't fit.
Right.
But recent discoveries revealed that sperm possess a truncated, highly modified version of what's called the base excision repair pathway.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it utilizes an enzyme called OGG1 to scan the tightly packed DNA for oxidized damage and essentially snip out and patch the errors.
It's like a microscopic repair crew working inside a packed filing cabinet.
Exactly. But this system degrades as men age. The body actually has a bouncer at the door called apoptosis.
A bouncer?
Yeah, it's a programmed cell death sequence that forces defective cells to self-destruct before they can be deployed. But as a man gets older, that apoptotic bouncer gets lazy.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, damaged cells slip through the quality control checks, leading to higher rates of DNA double-strand breaks in the deployed payload.
The margin for error is incredibly thin, which makes the behavior of the DNA itself quite interesting. Like, the text mentioned genetic recombination.
Right, the process where chromosomes swap pieces to create genetic diversity.
Exactly. It happens at different rates. Maternal DNA in the egg recombines about 42 times on average. But the paternal DNA inside the sperm only recombines about 27 times.
It's as if the paternal side prioritizes stability and delivery over genetic shuffling.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The final breach.
Oh, yeah.
Once they survive the acid, evade the immune system, and outpace the defective cells, they have to physically locate the target. And they don't just swim randomly, do they?
No, they use chemotaxis. The cells have olfactory receptors. They literally sniff out a chemical gradient emitted by the egg and swim toward the source.
They sniff their way there.
They do. But the closer they get to the source, the more their environment changes. The egg is surrounded by a thick layer of cumulus cells and a highly viscous gel-like substance made of hyaluronic acid.
Like hitting a wall of molasses.
Exactly. And the standard rhythmic swimming motion they use to travel through the reproductive tract isn't powerful enough to get through this barrier. So they undergo a behavioral shift called hyperactivation.
It's the biological equivalent of hitting the nitrous boost in a racing game.
Perfect analogy.
They stop swimming in a straight line, and their tails start thrashing with pure, erratic, whip-like power to violently punch through the gel. But how does the cell trigger that burst of energy?
Well, it relies on specific ion channels located in the tail, known as Caspar channels. When the sperm detects it is near the egg, these channels pop open.
Just pop open?
Yeah, and this causes a sudden, massive influx of calcium ions to flood into the flagellum. That rapid change in cellular chemistry alters the motor proteins, causing those deep asymmetrical bends that generate the sheer physical force needed to bore through the hyaluronic acid.
And once they punch through that outer gel, they hit the final barrier, the zona pellucida, which is the protective shell of the egg itself. And this is where the acrosome, that sac of enzymes in the head we talked about, is finally triggered.
Right. The acrosome reaction is just a masterclass in biological security. The sac ruptures, releasing the digestive enzymes to dissolve a pathway through the shell. But it isn't just indiscriminate acid.
It's not.
No, it relies on an incredibly precise lock-and-key mechanism. The sperm has to bind to a very specific receptor protein on the egg called ZP3.
ZP3.
Yes, and this binding is species-specific. It acts as an evolutionary failsafe, ensuring that human sperm can only trigger the reaction on a human egg.
Wow.
Once that lock turns, the membranes fuse, the 23 chromosomes are pulled inside, and the egg instantly alters its outer shell to prevent any other sperm from entering.
The fact that any of us exist at all is staggering when you consider the gauntlet that a single cell had to run.
It truly is.
But I want to pull back from the microscopic mechanisms for a second and look at how humans interact with this biology. Because this genetic payload is so valuable, we haven't just left it to nature. We've figured out how to extract, store, and commercialize it, which introduces a bizarre global market and some very strange legal frameworks.
The foundation of that market is our ability to artificially pause the biological clock. Scientists use an IVT diluent to keep the cells viable outside the body.
So it's not just stored in water.
Oh, no, it's a precisely engineered cocktail. It includes salts to maintain osmotic pressure so the cells don't burst, sugars to fuel those mitochondria in the midpiece, and antibacterial agents.
Because of the sugar.
Right. If you put a sugar-rich fluid in a warm environment, bacteria will colonize it instantly. They also pump it with CO2 to stabilize the pH. With that diluent, you can keep the cells alive at room temperature for over 7 days.
And if you drop the temperature entirely with cryopreservation, you freeze molecular motion completely. The text actually noted the current record for a successful human birth using frozen sperm is 21 years.
You are literally pausing a potential human life across decades.
Which leads right into the massive global sperm economy. Denmark, specifically, is a titan in this industry. They export human sperm to over 50 countries. Yet, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration heavily restricts or outright bans these imports.
The contrast there is fascinating. Denmark dominates because their market is highly structured and transparent. Donors are rigorously screened, they're often highly educated, and the clinics provide extensive profiles, baby photos, audio interviews, things like that.
Yeah.
Furthermore, Denmark gives donors the option to be non-anonymous, which is highly sought after by a lot of receiving couples.
So why does the FDA block a resource that 50 other nations completely trust?
Well, the FDA's restriction is officially based on the theoretical risk of transmitting Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, more commonly known as mad cow disease.
Mad cow disease. But, based on the anatomical mechanisms we just went through, a prion transmission seems biologically absurd.
It borders on the impossible. Creutzfeldt-Jakob is caused by prions, which are misfolded proteins. For a prion to be transmitted via seminal fluid, it would have to circulate in the man's blood and then successfully navigate across the blood-testis barrier.
The wall we talked about.
Right. That barrier is expressly designed to keep large immune proteins out of the seminiferous tubules. The statistical probability is vanishingly small, yet it forms the basis of a rigid international regulatory ban.
It really highlights how regulatory law often struggles to keep pace with biological reality. And, I mean, the legal philosophy gets even weirder when we talk about ownership. Like, what exactly is a frozen sperm cell in the eyes of the law?
That's a huge debate.
The source material references a 2009 UK Court of Appeal ruling, which heavily cited a landmark 1993 California case called Hecht v. Superior Court. The courts determined that ejaculated sperm, preserved for reproductive purposes, is legally considered the property of the man who produced it.
It forces the legal system to define cellular biology through the lens of asset management. The reasoning essentially rests on the idea that because the individual generated the cells, and because those cells hold unique future utility, specifically the creation of human life, the man retains a tangible property interest in them.
It transforms microscopic machines into a legally protected estate. We apply human legal constraints to it, but, nature doesn't care about our laws or our textbook diagrams. If we look beyond humans, the extremes of the animal kingdom make our reproductive biology look incredibly tame.
Oh, absolutely. Human biology is quite conservative compared to what happens in, say, insects. Take Drosophila bifurca, which is a species of fruit fly.
Okay.
It produces the largest known spermatozoon in the entire natural world. The single cell measures over 58 millimeters long.
I crunched the numbers on that while I was
Yeah.
reading the notes. 58 millimeters is over 2 inches long.
Right.
That is 20 times the entire length of the fly producing it. Like, if a human male produced a single gamete scaled to 20 times his body length, he would be launching a single cell the size of a blue whale.
It's hard to even picture.
Why did the fruit fly need a 2-inch-long sperm cell?
It is the ultimate brute force strategy for sperm competition. Female fruit flies have a seminal receptacle where they store sperm from multiple mates. The massive length of this cell allows it to physically displace the sperm of rival males. It acts like a microscopic broom, sweeping competitors out of the storage organ to ensure its own genetic material is used. Producing a cell that massive requires immense metabolic energy, which also acts as a biological signal to the female that this specific male possesses superior, highly resilient genetics.
It's extreme physical warfare. But it's not always about competition, right? Sometimes you see incredible cooperation. The wood mouse is a perfect example of that.
Yes, the wood mouse possesses a really unique anatomical feature. It has an apical hook on the head of the sperm. So instead of swimming as isolated individuals, they use these hooks to latch onto the flagella of other sperm from the same male.
So they link up.
Exactly. They form literal mobile trains consisting of hundreds or even thousands of cells. By swimming together in an aggregate formation, they alter the fluid dynamics around them, achieving significantly faster motility through the female reproductive tract than a single cell ever could alone.
It's a cooperative transit system. And just to break all the rules entirely, there are organisms where the gametes don't even swim at all.
Right. Certain red algae and fungi produce completely non-motile cells called spermatia. They have no tails.
So how do they get anywhere?
Well, some rust fungi even secrete a sugary nectar to attract flies, and the flies inadvertently carry the spermatia to nearby organisms. It's an exact mimicry of how bees pollinate flowers, but applied to microscopic fungal reproduction.
It really drives home the point that evolution doesn't favor one specific diagram. It only favors whatever mechanism successfully bridges the gap between two halves of a genetic code, whether that requires a 58-millimeter broom, a cooperative train, or a hijacked insect.
That's exactly it.
So the next time you think about the origins of your own life, toss out that flat 2D circle with a squiggly line. Picture the 3-month assembly line. Remember the 7,500 proteins, the stealth bomber glycoprotein invisibility cloak, the physical barricades, and the calcium-triggered nitrous boost through hyaluronic acid.
It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is an unparalleled sequence of chemical engineering that had to execute flawlessly for you to be here.
What's fascinating to me here is how our perception has evolved over time. I mean, in 1677, Antony van Leeuwenhoek was the first human to ever observe these cells through a primitive microscope.
1677.
Yeah, and he named them animalcules, or little animals. At the time, the prevailing scientific theory was preformationism, which is the belief that each cell contained a microscopic, fully formed human sitting right inside it.
Just a tiny little person.
Right. Today, obviously, we know that's not true. But when you examine the immense automated complexity packed inside that tiny space, you realize Leeuwenhoek's sense of absolute awe was entirely justified.
It's a microscopic machine carrying the blueprint of our species. Which leaves me with one final thought for you to ponder. We've established how vulnerable these cells are once they shed their cytoplasm. We've talked about how their DNA repair pathways degrade over time and how susceptible they are to modern industrial realities. Forever chemicals, benzene, and insecticides.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Given how heavily industrialized our daily environment has become, how might those invisible chemicals be quietly rewriting the genetic future of human evolution, one microscopic cell at a time? It definitely makes you look at that simple high school diagram in a much more profound light.